How's it going, YouTube? Today I wanted to look at generative music and generative sequencing in modular, or in this case, in VCV Rack. I really love generative music. I really love making sequences that are generative in nature. It's a lot of fun, and there are a lot of use cases for it. So let's just dive in. Here I've got a little sequence going. I don't know if I'd call it a sequence. Sequence implies that you have, input notes, and then it will sequence and cycle around those notes. That's not what is going on here. I've got a sample and hold module here from Bog Audio. I've talked about sample and hold before. A little quick rundown on it in case you don't know. Basically, sample and hold takes a signal, any signal, but usually it's noise, like white noise or pink noise, and you feed it a gate or a clock, and every time that gate or clock strikes, it samples whatever pitch or frequency, whatever that noise is at, and then it holds it at that pitch or frequency for a determined amount of time, or until it is gated again. And so what that really means is you just end up with random intervals, because noise is inherently just a random signal, a source of randomness. So in this case, you can see the output of the sample and hold on the scope. It's just kind of randomly fluctuating within this range. I've got that going into this quantizer, which is going into this macro oscillator, and it sounds like this. Now, I do have a few effects on it because effects just make everything nicer. But really, this sequence will just continue forever. It will always change. It will never be the same. It will always evolve. And that's kind of the nature of sample and hold. If you don't quantize it, it ends up sounding like this. So it's still random, but the pitches are all over the place, which can be cool. It's certainly good for modulation, but maybe for pitch, it's better if it's quantized. So this is just a really basic example to express how simple generative sequencing can be. Sample and hold is like a really good place to start with it, I would say. There are lots of other ways you can, or lots of other methods that you can employ to create generative music, but this is probably the most straightforward. To add a wrinkle of complexity to it though, I've got this Euclidean sequencer up here, which is being heavily modulated by this Lorenz algorithm random generator, which is from Wicked. If I take the output of that, you can see on the scope, it's just kind of randomly swinging between various frequencies. And they are modulating the length and the hits and the shift of the Euclidean sequence. So as you can see on this little display, we get an ever-evolving sequence or rhythm. So I'm currently clocking this sequence with a clock. It's coming out of this Venom patch bay, but the clock is elsewhere in my session. However, let's just take these gates out, and instead of going from there, we go out of the Euclidean sequencer and we go into the envelope as well. Now we have a much more interesting sequence, still completely random. It will never be the same, it will always change. I think Euclidean sequences are really excellent at creating rhythms, and especially if you modulate them like this, you can get some really interesting stuff. But for creating rhythms, they're really awesome. I often use them in conjunction with sequences, like pitch sequences. But anyway, that's kind of the vibe of this little patch. Let's look at something else. because I've got this other sequence here. Let's just mute that one. So now this is less generative and less random because these sequences, ions and entropia, work in similar ways to each other. They aren't totally random because they have you input notes into it. So you use these knobs to set frequencies. So it is set, but what makes it random is the way it runs through the sequence. So with ions, we have the top circle is one sequence, the bottom circle is a different sequence. In the middle, they have this shared knob here, but they can also, as you can see from the little lights, they swap. The blue sequence will come down to the yellow one, and the yellow one will go up to the blue one at the top, depending on how you've got this probability knob set. So if you have it set so there's no probability, they will stay in their little circles, but if you have it set to a different probability, they will occasionally swing into one another. And so I've got this sequence, the two outputs going into a quantizer again and into two energy modules, also from geodesics. And so we're getting this sequence, and it is, like I said, it is like I have set these frequencies, but the way that it flows through them means that it is quite random. And I would argue it evolves over time, and it never really is quite the same. And another factor that makes it not quite the same is the fact that I'm using this clock divider to send the top sequence and the bottom sequence different clocks. So they run through their sequence at different rates. And they kind of overlap one another in this nice way. And then down the bottom here I've got Entropia. Let's just bring that in and solo it. So with Entropia, it's similar in that you've got this inner circle is one sequence, and the outer circle is another sequence, and these knobs in the middle control the probability about which frequency it's going to select as it runs around these two sequences. There's only one output, so in this case, I've set these frequencies again, but the probabilities are kind of randomly selected, and it's going to flip between them sort of randomly. I've also got a certain clock here and an uncertain clock input, which means we get a different rhythm. As you can hear, it sort of flicks. It's not a straight rhythm. So this little example is generative, but it's loosely generative. And I sort of set this up to demonstrate that not all generative music has to be completely random, kind of not very musical, perhaps. I think there is a bit of a, what's the word, cliche with modular music where a lot of it just sounds like shit. And that's not always true, but sometimes it is, because it's just like an experimental playground, you know? Some stuff's not going to work, or it is going to work, but it's not going to sound very musical, I guess is what I mean. But in this case, I'm using dark energy here. Got a bit of slew going, a little bit of an LFO as well. And that's going out into this liquid filter, which is being modulated again by another one of these wicked modules. This one's the Lorenz algorithm. So let's bring the other two back in. So this is quite structured, but it's random at the same time. So I like that. Gives it something you can sort of rely on, but always surprises you as well. So let's look at something else. Let's just mute these. So down here, I have this drum beat, and I've got a Euclidean sequencer, and it is controlling these drum voices. I've got a bass drum, a snare drum, and a hi-hat. Out of the the hits. The hits are controlling the bass drum, and the rests are hitting the snare drum. And I'm modulating the Euclidean sequence as well. So similar to before, I'm modulating the hits and the length, as you can see here. But I'm also modulating the clock that is running the Euclidean sequencer. And the way I'm doing that is I've got this straight clock into a clock divider. I'm using the top 5 outputs, and I'm sending them into a switch, an 8-to-1 switch. The switch is being clocked by the same clock as that's going into the clock divider, and the output of that is clocking the Euclidean sequencer. This switch is also set to random, so it will select one of these at random with the clock. And similarly, over here I'm using a random. We'll get to that in a second though. But anyway, the point is that this drum beat is completely random. It's never gonna be the same from one bar to the next. The timing of it is all random as well. With the hi-hat, I'm using the output, the same output as the bass drum, which is going into chances, which is a Bernoulli gate, and I'm only using output A, so it's 50% of the time it will have the input, the other 50% of the time it won't. But then it's going into a burst generator to give us more triggers. And the burst generator the timing of it is being modulated by this sample and hold here. And the sample and hold is being gated by the same input as what's triggering the burst generator. So the hi-hat is having these bursts, which is interesting. But to go along with this drum beat, I have this other sequence, which is also from a Euclidean sequencer, this Eugene sequencer from Rare Breeds. Really love this Euclidean sequencer. I am modulating the number of hits with Brains, which is a sample and hold. Brains is an excellent module. I should do a whole video on Brains at some point. But basically, the timing of this sequencer, or like the clock, is this Euclidean sequencer. So the rhythm of it is ever evolving. The rhythm is random. It's never going to be the same twice. And that clock is then clocking these steps on this sequencer, and I've got it set to random. So even though I've input these notes, it will randomly select whichever one is going to play with the clock. And that is going out into the quantizer, and then it's going into this XFX wave module from Blamsoft, which is a really great wavetable synthesis module. That's going out into the XFX F35 filter module, also from Blamsoft. Really great filter module. I'm also using this sample and hold here from Amalgamated Harmonics, which is a pretty cool sample and hold because it also has a glide feature. You can also select different noise types, and you can change the slope between the steps, which is, normally you have to use two modules to get that. I really like that it's just in this one module, a very small module. It's pretty cool. So yeah, we got this random beat, we got this random sequence. I don't think any of it sounds unmusical. I think it sounds cool and interesting and intriguing, and I want to keep listening to it. And I think that's what you want from generative music, is for it to just go on forever, like an organism. It's alive, It figures itself out. It just goes forever. So let's just mute these, and we'll move on to our next example, which is this one here. And in this case, I'm driving it similar to before. I'm driving it with a sample and hold, which in this case is Brains. I've got two different clocks running Brains. I've got a fast clock running the bottom circle and a slower clock running the top circle. So that's just gating the sample and hold. And then I've got two outputs going into the quantizer from the top circle and one output from the bottom into the quantizer. And these three pitches are going into the volt per octave on this 3 oscillator called Trosk from DeBiz. Absolutely love the DeBiz modules. I would love to do more videos on DeBiz. Great stuff. They're just awesome modules. They sound great. Really like the way they look as well. And keeping with DeBiz, I've also got this envelope generator, which has got 4 envelope generators in it. I'm triggering them with the same clocks that are triggering the brains. And it's just a basic attack decay. And so that is controlling the level output on each of these oscillators. And then the main output, which sums them all together, is going into this DeBiz filter module, which is the dual filter from DeBiz. It's going into A, and then it's going out of A into B, and then out B into Debriatus. So it's a dual filter. I talked about this a few weeks ago, really great little module. And out of Debriatus, it goes into this EQ filter, so I'm just taking off some of the low end with this shelf and boosting a little bit of the high end with a high shelf. That's going into this compressor. So the point is, though, is that this is entirely random. All of these notes are driven by sample and hold, which are driven by noise. Completely random set of sequences. Will never be the same. The way they overlap with one another, the way that they are sort of at different time signatures, or not time signatures, different timings, means that they kind of just dance around each other, almost like an arpeggio. I just think it sounds amazing. I really love this kind of synth sound. It's not a pad, but it sort of fulfills a similar role because it sits as a bed for other things to lay on top. Yes, it is several different pitches. It is a sequence of notes rather than a sustained chord, but because they kind of overlap one another and because they've got some effects on them, they kind of just meld together in this kind of nice, sparkly, twinkly bed of sound. And I really like that. So this one I think is really interesting, and it's just a really great, super simple way of creating a generative sequence. Let's look at our final example. So, just going to turn this down a little bit while I talk. So, this sequence is running entirely from this DocB module called CYC, which is a fantastic sequencer. Basically, you've got all of these different pitches. You have 6 different lanes of sequences, and you can place them anywhere along this circle. So the offset knob here, like with the red one, as you can see when I move it, it goes anywhere around. So with each of these 4 lanes that I've got active, they kind of offset from one another, like greens here, yellows here, pinks here, and reds there. But you can overlap them. Like, they can be anywhere. It doesn't really matter. And you can modulate the offset as well, which is really powerful. It's just an awesome module. And to get these pitches, I literally just selected Randomized, and then I set all of these knobs to default, and then I set the offsets how I wanted. One thing I forgot to do was change these from their random setting, but that's okay because it still sounds great. So you get forward, backwards, backwards, forwards, random, and another random. I'm not really sure what the difference is between these two. But anyway, it's giving us 4 different notes, which are going into this quantizer, and then it's the 4 notes are coming out and going into this merge module, which is giving us 2 polyphonic signals, identical polyphonic signals. and they are going into these two oscillators from synthesizers.com. I've got one of them slightly detuned against the other one, so we get a nice, you know, ensemble sort of detuned sound. The output is going into this little amplifier, and then the dual outputs of here are going into these two state variable filters from synthesizers.com as well. And the output of that is going into this VCA, just so I sort of control the volume of it. I've got this envelope generator here, which is controlling the filter, as well as the volume output of the amplifier. So it's an extremely simple patch, and it's just a pad machine, basically. But these pads will go on forever, and they will just be new chords all the time. And because I'm clocking them at different rates with this clock divider, as you can see is flashing here, the notes just like overlay one another. It's just this like ocean of sound. It feels like waves almost, you know? And I think it sounds terrific. I really love this kind of sound. Reminds me a little bit of Autica, like early Autica, but it also has vibes of like various Brian Eno ambient albums, especially his early stuff, early ambient work. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight this because this is, again, it's totally random. Really easy to set up. This sequencer is so great. It's so great for so many different things. And this is just how I wanted to use it in this instance. But you can run an entire track off this thing with its six tracks. Really amazing stuff. Okay, so now all of these sequences work together. So let's listen. And the sequence at the start that I showed you, this one over here, will also work with it. So yeah, hopefully that gives you some inspiration. Maybe gives you some ideas of ways to tackle generative music. This is just scratching the surface, really. There are just so many methods, techniques to get generative sequences going in modular. So the world's really your oyster when it comes to modular. And I would highly recommend exploring these methods and any others that you come across. There are specific modules which are just designed around creating generative sequences, so you know, you can just use them as well. There's like really just so many ways to do it. And I'll just say, like the JW modules, there's a few sequences in there which are just an all-in-one generative sequence creator. So I would definitely recommend checking out the JW modules. But that's going to do it for me today. I'm just going to let this play out. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Bye.